Thank you all for joining us today. It looks like we're gonna have a nice intimate session, hopefully in your right spot. So today our session is called From Data to Impact, Co-Developing Earth Science Tools with End Users. I am Kristen Robb. I'm a senior research scientist at the Global Resilience Institute at Northeastern University. I'm the PI of the study that we're gonna be focusing on today. And I'm also I call myself an interdisciplinary scientist, but I focus on community engagement and social science. And then I'm going to just pass it off to my team members if you wouldn't mind introducing yourselves really quick. Emma, if you could go.
Hi, everyone. My name's Emma. I'm a senior research associate at the Global Resilience Institute. I have a background in environmental science and policy, and I've been helping out in this project for the last year. So lovely to meet you all.
Thanks, Emma. Tony.
Hi, I'm Tony Castronova. I'm the lead of research at the Consortium of Universities for the Advancement of Hydrologic Science Incorporated, also known as QUASI. And my background is in surface water hydrology and hydroinformatics.
Thanks, Tony. And Irene.
Thanks, Kristen. My name is Irene Gersinajad. I'm a research scientist at QUASI, and my background is in hydrologic modeling and snow modeling.
Awesome. And then as we get started, I was wondering if the participants in the room wouldn't mind just using the Zoom chat we have here and maybe just introducing yourself briefly, just name where you're affiliated with, maybe where you're calling in from. I'm joining you today from Vergennes, Vermont, a teeny town 45 minutes south of Burlington. And then if you wouldn't mind too, if there's anything in particular you're looking to get out of the session, so just a short bio, and if you wouldn't mind just kind of leaving that in the chat as we get started here. So an overview of what we're hoping to do today. So first, there will be the kind of talking at you piece, but then we're hoping the second half of the session will translate into more of a discussion while we kind of working together. So because we're talking about co-development and engaging end users, I'm first just going to give a few slides about what community engagement is and why it matters, mostly just to make sure that we're all kind of thinking about the same things and on the same page. Then we are going to share a study, but the study is meant to be kind of like a case study or inspiration to then spur the rest of our discussions. We're going to go over Emma and Tony and Irene and my experience co-developing Flood Savvy with end users. Then after talking about it, I'm just going to share my screen and do just a live demo to kind of show you physically what it is that we developed to meet community needs. And then I'm hoping to spend at least maybe 30, 45 minutes, depending on how many questions we get at the end, where we would like to discuss. So some of my questions is, as you saw, our team is very interdisciplinary. We have social scientists and hydrologists. We have learned a lot from each other working together, and I think we all have a lot of different and new perspectives on the benefits and how to do end user engagement as part of being a part of the study. But something we see is that sometimes social scientists don't know how to engage with hydrologists, or earth scientists maybe don't really know how to start community engagements. We're hoping to have a discussion that's kind of action-oriented in terms of what experiences have others had in end user engagement or community engagement, co-development, that type of thing. What questions do you have? What support do you wish that you had, or resources that you wish you saw? So this can ideally maybe inform directly ESIP. Maybe these are things that ESIP could provide, or folks like myself who love to research in this area, maybe this will help spur new things. So anyway, that's the lay of the land. That's what we're hoping to get at. And then in terms of our key takeaways, what we are hoping that you leave with is some real examples of what community engagement or end user engagement actually looks like in practice when working with earth science data, some tools or techniques or lessons learned that you might walk away with to apply to your own work. And then ideally, maybe we have a vision for ESIP support or how they could engage more in this space moving forward. So that's what we're hoping to accomplish. And as I said, we just want to set the stage of making sure when I say community engagement, you are also thinking of the same thing. So if any of you attended July last year, the session, some of these slides will look similar, but we promise the rest of the presentation will be different. But what is community engagement? To me, the definition I like is community engagement is an applied practice of involving stakeholders in decision-making, research, or a project. And to me, community engagement, in essence, is when you're doing science with people. So that means anybody that your work is intended to benefit, if they're intended to use it, if it's intended to make somebody do anything better, that is the end user, and that is the community or group of folks that you were hoping to engage. And the difference between that and social science is I see social science as study of people. So you don't have to actually talk to them. You just have to study them. And then community engagement is when you are bringing them along as part of the process. And I'm going to say community engagement. I might say end user engagement, but there is a lot of different terms and they definitely all mean different things, but you may have been more familiar with any of these other terms. But really, we're talking about any of our co-terms: co-development, co-design, co-investigate, participatory research, community engagement, stakeholder engagement, that sort of a thing. And then why might we want to do this? So I like this NOAA of Office of Coastal Management document that I found on Intro to Stakeholder Participation. So they tout that when you engage the users of your research, you can produce better outcomes and decisions. You can get better support for these decisions. You can bring to light important knowledge that might influence and make your research better. It can help agencies understand flaws in existing management strategies. And then what I think is most important is that this quote down here is co-production can actually increase the likelihood that the services or science or tools that you're creating will be used in general, used for a long time, and that they will be continuously updated or improved. So the reason I like community engagement and end user engagement in earth science data, or basically just science in general, is I think that it makes it more actionable, more used, and more impactful, which I think is typically always our goal as scientists. And then, as I mentioned, we are using the study we'll get into of how we created Flood Savvy. And I want to highlight that that is one example because community engagement will look different in every single project that you apply it to, because not only is it a spectrum, and that's what this is, the IAP2 spectrum, which goes from really, really low engagement and 4, meaning you did a study and you just, hey, you wanted somebody to know about it, so you just went and gave them a presentation. So it's sort of engagement. You did a study and at least you're telling them about it. To consult, meaning you might do a couple of interviews just to understand somebody's perspective and then just go on and do your study. And then on the right side, to me, is where the real engagement happens, which is involve, collaborate, or empower, which kind of moves from maybe regular checking in to make sure you're keeping up to date on nuances or changes in opinions or priorities or uses. Partnering, meaning, hey, then those stakeholders start to influence how you are doing your study. Maybe they start to influence how you are designing something or what you might prioritize. And then empower is at the end, which is meaning you are actually giving decision-making power and influence over your study. So it's saying, if you say, hey, stakeholder, do you want A or B? And they say B, B's the answer. So it's a spectrum. It will not look the same. And there's a lot of different ways that you can do it. And just because we did a very heavy level of community engagement, which fit the needs of our project, does not necessarily mean that that's what is true for every project. So anyway, maybe I'll just pause. Did any questions about just community engagement in general pop up? No? Okay. Perfect. So I highlight that to say community engagement can mean a lot of different things, but what we would like to share is our experience doing end user engagement to co-create Flood Savvy, which translates NOAA's National Water Model data into easy to understand flood risk insights. So we created Flood Savvy at the very tail end of a 3-year study that has overarchingly sought to investigate how can NOAA's National Water Model be used in community resilience planning, and how can NOAA or the National Water Center help support this use. So at the very, very beginning of this study, it was simply just exploratory. We were interviewing folks that identified in the resilience planning space and just trying to understand, how does what I call resilience planning actually operate in practice, which meant, what does that term mean to them? What kinds of decisions are they trying to make? What information are they using? What challenges are they having? What information do they wish they had, et cetera? And then we were also trying to understand how the National Water Model could then support that context that we were investigating. So I just want to note this, that we did not set out in this project to develop Flood Savvy. Flood Savvy is something that naturally emerged after our bottom-up engagement. So the biggest thing we learned in this first phase on the left is that 65% of the folks that we talked to had actually never heard of the National Water Model before. But then once they had a lot of ideas for how they could use it. So that brought us to our second phase of the study. And I should mention, each of these phases are about a year. The second phase of the study, once we knew that, yes, this is a context in which folks wanted this information and they have ideas for how to use it, we actually wanted to try it out. So we actually worked with 6 different groups of these folks across the US to actually try out how, using National Water Model data as it stands today, how could they apply it in the decision-making context they wanted to use it. And the biggest thing we found in the second phase was that there's a whole range of folks who want to use the data, which range from folks that have absolutely no hydrology GIS technical experience to those that very much do, and they're technical experts. And then a whole bunch of intended uses, meaning some folks didn't even really want to work with the national water model at all. They just wanted it to use it to start conversations. That's a very non-technical example. To others who actually wanted to access the historical streamflow simulations that the national water model has, which to me actually requires Irene and Tony, two PhD hydrologists, in order to access, work with, and actually produce something that's impactful in these kind of decision contexts. So what we found was a lot of accessibility challenges, which brings us to the third phase, and which is what we're mostly talking about today, is now that we knew that people wanted this data, but they had a hard time using it, let's actually figure out what we can do about this. So the third phase, we were deeply investigating and piloting ways to overcome these accessibility challenges to using the National Water Model in resilience planning. So I wanted to highlight this whole spectrum to say that we were using an existing resource. So the National Water Model already exists. We didn't start out saying we want to build a product, because the opposite is, hey, I built this tool. Now let's find a decision-making context. This was bottom up, and then we'll kind of show you what this came about. So in the third phase, to investigate these accessibility challenges, we worked with 3 communities in Vermont and 3 in Missouri. And what we were trying to seek out is working with boundary organizations, so organizations that are already established and already supporting local communities. How could they leverage the National Water Model to increase the communities they support capacity to engage with resilience-related planning and decision-making? And obviously, this is often in the context of like flooding. So in Vermont, we worked with 3 regional planning commissions, because Vermont, we don't have county level government. So we have these regional planning commissions that support all of our teeny tiny towns. And then in Missouri, so in Vermont, we had the Windham Regional Commission, Manascutney, and the Two Rivers Ottaquechee Regional Commission. And then in Missouri, we were working with the Missouri Hydrology Information Center, so MOHIC. And then as our boundary organization, so they were at the state level through DNR. And then they have 3 communities they chose, which is Roaring River State Park, DeSoto, and then Springfield Greene County. So we mentioned this was very bottom up. So this is the method that we used and iterated on. So first, in this third phase, we started with a bunch of interviews. So we sat down and spoke one-on-one to all of these boundary organizations and all of the communities they support to better understand what kind of water hazards they were concerned about, what kinds of decisions were they trying to make, and what information do they wish they had but they don't have access to, as well as what did they see that they could maybe use the National Water Model for. So we did not come in identifying, like, this was the needs assessment part, which we think was really, really important, is we wanted to first identify the need, not the solution. Sometimes it's opposite. We have a solution and we're trying to find a need. Then for the second part, we just did a National Water Model deep dive. This was because, of course, we learned previously in the study, a lot of folks aren't really familiar with the National Water Model. So we did a deep dive to make sure they really understand what it was, what its capabilities were, and all the ins and outs. And then the third part is we held collaborative sessions, which is where, so we talked to everybody first individually, but then we brought them together as groups, and these are groups based on community or region, where we facilitated discussions that not only kind of shared, hey, this is what we heard from you, these are the challenges, these are the ideas for how we could use the National Water Model, but then how, the real question we were asking was how or what resources would they do they wish that they had that would make this information easier for them to use in these contexts that they have. So this is actually one of the slides that we would use often in these discussions. So this is a screenshot of when you go to water.noaa.gov. This is NOAA's National Water Prediction Service. This is where you can access the National Water Model. This is what shows up when you go to the homepage. So what we were asking is, okay, you want to use this data. It is all publicly available. You can, quote unquote, access it today. But what other resources would help you access and use the information available from either NWIPS generally or National Water Model specifically to aid you in your work? So this is then how we started to conceptualize Flood Savvy. So starting from there, we got a lot of answers about, this is a big national map. Oh, I wish that I could just zoom right into my area or things like that. So we then, in social science, we would call it thematic analysis, but really all that matters here is we just created buckets. And so we looked at all of our data, all of our interview data, all of these conversations we had. And across the top of this table here, all of these C's, these are different capabilities that we heard that folks maybe wanted. And these included a regionalized map interface. So they just wanted something very specific to their community. They wanted a flow time series. They just wanted to very simply see what the stream flow of a river of interest looked like over time. They wanted to see what a flood boundary might look like for a particular event. They wanted to download results or identify a vulnerable area, et cetera. So What you see in green is each of these communities on the left. Every time that somebody from their community, either in an interview or conversation, that they identified that need, we just marked it green. So this was how we decided, okay, so there's, I think, 9 on this table. Given the, constraints of our time and resources, we couldn't do all of them, but we said, okay, which ones did most folks want? And then this is how we started our design of Flood Savvy. So we identified that need first. This is the science part. We put a little method to the madness, and then this is how we kind of made our decisions. And then the whole way through, we were also working with them closely. So at no point did we disappear, I think, for more than, 2 weeks without some sort of contact with all of our stakeholders. So from those interviews, from our co-designing sessions, then we started our what we call our co-development process, which is when Irene and Tony worked magic, honestly, and started actually putting together a prototype of Flood Savvy. So this was not a one-off. So again, this was a meeting where we kind of decided on a vision, and then basically either with a bi-weekly meeting, so like every 2 weeks we would send an update on our progress, or if we had a particular question we needed some feedback on, that was bare minimum. And I think roughly once a month or once every other month, we actually held a virtual meeting with everyone to kind of give an update. Started off with slides before the prototype was live, and then it started off with a little bit of screen sharing to kind of show what we were working on and to get feedback. So what you're seeing in these screenshots were from our prototype, like a Flood Savvy 1.0, where you can see here, they wanted a flood extent visualizer. So here is on the top panel, you can see that there's a little thermometer. So this is something that we started with. Hey, how do we actually start simulating what a stream flow would mean in terms of a flood extent in this particular area? And then in the bottom, you can see that we heard over and over again, folks wanted just a simple flow time series. So here in these bottom panels, you can see that they have a historical stream flow, forecasted stream flow, and again, that stage flow visualizer on the bottom. And then once we had a working prototype, we did user testing, which is really, I think, probably one of the most informative steps that we did. So for user testing, we had each group of folks set up a meeting with us. And what we did is I'll show you Flood Savvy next, but we walked through every single one of Flood Savvy's pages and sort of just asked them, hey, what do you like or dislike about this page? What's more important? Basic, it's basically user experience methodology is where we took inspiration from to get specific guidance. And then we also had task-based things that we did. So we said, hey, pretend you have a forecasted flood in your future. Starting from our homepage, like use screen share. We're not going to say anything. Walk us through how you would identify if this is going to be an issue and your decision-making process. So here, what you'll see is some of the changes that we started to make specifically because of that user testing. So you'll see on this page, the top panel, you see how opaque this flood extent boundary is. On the right, we heard over and over again, man, I wish that was more transparent so we could actually see what was happening under the ground. So that was one of the first changes that we made. And then in the bottom, you can see the historical and forecasted stream flows. People were like, well, how do I know if that's normal or not for my area? Like often what we would see is in one of our forecasts, it would be really, really, really low, a little tiny spike, and people go, oh, there's definitely a flood in the future. But then if you look at what the stream flow actually was, it's actually pretty small, but just based on the scale of the graph, it looked big. How do people know if that's actually a flood or not? So we added these quantiles, which will show you if it's below average or above average or et cetera. So it kind of gives people a little bit of a benchmark to understand. But we wouldn't have known to do that until we did our user testing. So before we get into the demo of Flood Savvy, we just wanted to share some lessons. So what we learned or we thought helped make us successful in this co-development process that you might be able to apply to your own work. So for one, I think last time I did the session, people were like, well, but like, do you always have to design a new tool? Or is that the only time that you can do user testing? And I think the important thing to note is we designed and developed Flood Savvy, but we were basing this off of a tool that was already built and already deployed. The Flood Savvy or National Water Model, you can go to that right now. You can go to water.noaa.gov. That's already live and provided. So what our project did was we helped translate data into actionable insights for new end users. We took a product that already had a great audience that was already using it, and we expanded that. So we reached new users with new use cases, which is now increasing the impact and the usability of the National Water Model. We also think that our interdisciplinary research team was part of our success because we had social scientists like myself and Emma to lead our community engagement. We had hydrologists like Irene and Tony, which were able to build a robust and technically feasible product, but also not only just our interdisciplinary expertise. We were engaging NOAA throughout this whole process as well, because obviously we're working with a national water model. So we wanted to make sure that whatever we were pitching was in line with their mission and service delivery, and also our community stakeholders as well. So it's all of those different areas of expertise that came together, and I think that's really what contributed to our success. Also, we had a very intentional and flexible approach to our engagement. So sometimes that I'm a big planner myself. Sometimes that can obviously be scary because we all want a nice plan and to stay on time. But I think we, from the beginning in our project plan, built in periods of iteration. Because as I mentioned, we did not set out to build Flood Savvy. We wanted to investigate how to make the national water model more accessible. And it just so happened that the needs we identified led to us to develop Flood Savvy. So part of this was, after our interviews, we made sure to pause and digest and ask ourselves, do we need to change anything about our project plan? After we did our collaborative sessions, we paused and we looked at our data and we reflected and we decided how to change our project plan. So while we did have overarching things and things that we wrote in the grant we had to provide, we intentionally built in these periods to kind of flex the project to both meet the needs of our end users and what NOAA wanted and what we as scientists thought was the best outcome. The other biggest thing we learned, and we hope resonates with everybody, is that data availability does not equal accessibility. So technically, all of the data that we are working with and that Flood Savvy presents is available. Anybody could go and download it and have the data, but that does not necessarily mean that it is meeting the needs of those who want to use it. So oftentimes it's very easy at the end of a grant to be like, oh, I'm just going to make a web page. Oh, I'll make a tool and put it out there. But with working with folks, you can actually make the data, I don't know, just so much more useful and actually impactful. And anyway, just to note that availability is not accessibility, and really tying it to particular decision-making context really helps. And then I think the final one is that community engagement can really help move data from useful to used. So again, it's kind of similar to that last point, but community or co-development can ensure that solutions are relevant and then readily deployed by users. Because I think that's something that I often see is, I was actually asked one time at a conference of, as a hydrologist, like, so what do we need to get our data used more? Do we just need more of it or higher accuracy or whatever? And I think the challenge is really understanding the context of your end user is so important. Like, for example, all of the folks we worked with, a lot of them are volunteers. Like in Vermont, a lot of our town managers, our select board members, that's a volunteer capacity. So while I and probably a lot of the folks on this call are thinking about water all the time, the folks that we are working with, capacity is the term. They have so many things on their plate and they can't all the time. So trying to understand how much time do they have, what is the exact piece of data do they need, and also do they have time to learn a new tool? There's so many out there. So anyway, just a really important consideration. Okay, so next I would like to do an actual demo of Flood Savvy, but before I jump into there, I was just curious if we have any questions about the either community engagement, the co-development steps that we took with our project, or kind of, basically anything about what I just presented on.
Hi, I have a quick question.
Sure, go for it.
Thinking about how to identify communities to engage with, and thinking about the very beginning of Flood Savvy, how did you ID those groups in Vermont and the other spot to actually talk with and build those relationships?
That is an excellent question. So I'm from Vermont. So that was sort of an obvious answer. Vermont obviously is very, well, I don't know if it's obvious to everybody. We have a lot of flooding problems. We've had very significant monumental floods. 2023 floods often come up, and then we got hit year to the date on the anniversary in 2024. So that was kind of the obvious answer. I always start with the networks that I know. So for example, I'm in Vermont. I'm not at UVM, but I did my PhD at UVM. That's our local university, and work with them all the time. So you kind of start by asking, hey, do you know anybody here that I should be engaging with? So for example, through another project, I was already working with John Goff, the local person at the National Weather Service office in Vermont. So I was already working with him on another project. So I just asked him, and he's the one that put me in contact. And then usually it's just as simple as, here is an email explaining what I'm hoping to do. Would you have time to chat with me about my project? So usually to me, it's about finding one or two kind of keystone people in whatever community you want. And then always with my interviews, I'm snowballing. So basically once you have the first person, they kind of get to know you. And that's also why I like in like a face-to-face interview, because then, you know, like you can say my name, Kristen Robb, I don't know who you thought you were walking into, but then I show up, you know, and then hopefully, you know, then you actually get to know me and who I am as a human. And then hopefully over the course of our interview, you learn that I'm, well, not normal, but you know what I mean? A perfectly fine scientist. And you know what I mean? You understand what my project is about. And then at the end of that interview, I ask, hey, do you know of anybody else now that you know the topic and what I'm trying to do? Anybody else that I should talk to for this project? And then you kind of snowball. So I love a snowball recruitment approach in that. But really it's about once you find one person and you kind of make that connection, then you leverage your connections. And Missouri was because I was at AGU, saw a student giving a talk, was like, wow, I like that talk. Turns out then she connected me with her advisor. Turns out her advisor just came from Missouri and then put me in contact with Zach Becker from Mohick. So you know what I mean? It's not always as complicated as it sounds. It's really just who do you know? Or who do you know who might know somebody? And then you just kind of work from there. And then really it's once you get that first interview or that first connection, you know, and it's not all, like I think Emma was actually a part of a lot of those in Vermont. We had a couple of skeptical regional planning commission folks, but then you know, then you turn a corner and you meet the right person and then they want to talk with you. So it's not always a win, but you just kind of got to put yourself out there and it kind of goes from there. And always it's just ask, work your network. Who do you know that might be able to help you, kind of a thing. Yeah, exactly. You don't know who you don't know. So you just got to reach out and start, and somebody knows somebody usually. And again, and that's maybe why you pivot. And usually when I'm designing my studies, start with more and kind of have a backup plan, you know? Like I think in the first phase, we were working with like 6 different communities across the US. I think in my head, I knew that I could probably do what I wanted to do with 4. 6 was good, you know, and it actually turned out that Charlotte, North Carolina was actually really hard to engage with, you know, so we didn't really get a lot of data, but that was fine because you design your study to make sure that you had a backup plan, basically.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. Always happy to chat about this too. We'll have our emails and stuff later, but anyway, okay. So let me share again. So I'm going to show you Flood Savvy, but I just like to put this up as just a reminder. This is the National Water Model. This is live. This is water.noaa.gov. Anybody can type this in. So you show up, it's a map of the United States with lots of little dots around it. And then you can go over here and there's lots of little drop down windows and different things you can click and you can zoom in and out and that kind of a thing. So that's where we started this project from. This is Flood Savvy. So I think if you wouldn't mind, if Emma or somebody just wouldn't mind throwing a link in the chat. So this is live. Anybody can go to this right now. So it shows up and you just have a disclaimer. So this is something we worked with NOAA on. It's one of their asks, you know, making sure that we're communicating what we are doing well. So it's very clear that this is an experimental application of the National Water Model. So you just acknowledge that. And then this is our landing page. So at the top bar, we just have this little banner that scrolls through. These are some of the different features that Flood Savvy has. And then kind of right off the bat, so that we worked with those six different regions. We have little tiles here for our 3 regions in Missouri and our 3 in Vermont. You can click on any of them and it'll take you directly to your map page. So I've already got some of these preloaded, but this is what it shows up. So I clicked on Roaring River State Park. And then this is the image that you're directly directed to. So this is just the watershed boundary, because that's what we heard that folks wanted. They just wanted to snap right into their area. And then you'll see this like little green box and things like that. That was something that this is the Roaring River State Park boundary. That's another thing that we worked with our folks. This is something that they wanted. So here you can kind of zoom in to this area. And then what you're able to do is you can click on any of these river or stream reaches, and then you'll get this prompt for, do you want a flood map, historical data, or forecast? So I just already pulled some of this up, which you can say, hey, I want a different base map. So that was the original one. But if we go to this USGS base map, hey, look, now you can actually see that this is Roaring River State Park. Each of these pink circles is one of their campgrounds. You can actually kind of start to see these different campgrounds under these. So here, this is what the stream flow forecast looked like. That starts today, January 20th, and it'll go out to January 27th. And it looks like at Roaring River State Park, this is somewhere between 32 and 34 CFS. So you could say, okay, well, is that low? Is that high? What does that mean for Roaring River State Park? So then we go here and we say, click on historical quantiles, and we have the legend below that. So it looks like This is in the much below normal to below normal range. And I just gave a presentation in Missouri last week where our stakeholders from Missouri confirmed that they are actually having a very low flow conditions in their rivers right now. What we also knew our stakeholders wanted is to look at the past. So sometimes they just want to say, hey, what happened in the past? How might I look at that? So here, this is our historical stream flow data. We're able to adjust your start and end date. So I've already adjusted this back to 2021, but this goes as far back as 2016. So we can see here, okay, well, it looks like Roaring River State Park has had quite a few flood events. So it looks like this one in March of 2023 was somewhere in the 5,000s range, and this one up here got up to almost 6,000. So then what we can do is come over to this stage flow visualizer and then adjust this to be within that same range. And then you can start to see, okay, for an event like that, maybe back in 2023, what might the flood extent have looked like? So we can definitely see in this area, it looks like it's totally impacting these two campgrounds that they have. And then this is one of the use cases that the folks at Roaring River State Park stated, is that they themselves, like these are the park rangers, like the leaders of the park, they've been there for a while. They know, they remember, they've got a bush that they watch that tells them exactly when they got to start knocking on RV doors to tell everybody to evacuate. But they have a lot of new park rangers that come through because this is right outside the Ozarks. So they have, it's like a hot spot for new staff. They have a lot of folks that are just not familiar with the area at all. So they want to use Flood Savvy, and will be using Flood Savvy for training. So they want to come here and say, okay, let's look at this flood event that we had in 2023, and they'll put this up. And then they're going to talk through what they did in 2023 and what planning and steps they took. And then the goal being, okay, now let's talk through, what if this event happened next week? What would we do? So that's kind of how this translates from an immediate, yes, flood forecast, you got to flood immediately, what do you do? But also this planning and preparing. That's kind of, we use the term resilience early on. This is kind of where I'm seeing resilience come into this project. Okay, so that's the rough overview. Oh, and then we can also do this multi-reach. You can select multi-reaches at a time. Also, in Flood Savvy, we have this resources page. So we have resources specific to Flood Savvy and resources specific to the National Water Model and NWIPS. So for Flood Savvy, we heard that folks wanted different scenarios. So these are PDFs that you can link to here that will walk you through step by step with lots of screenshots on different scenarios. So this first one is, how would you use historical stream flow data to evaluate past flood events? So that'll walk you through, starting on the homepage, how do you navigate to this information in your area? And then how might you interpret what you mean? Like, what would you do with that information? Similarly, pairing historical stream flow with flood maps to identify vulnerable areas. That's something that we heard a lot is, hey, well, how do I know where I shouldn't be building, or maybe should be building, or should be watching out for, etc. Or, hey, you have a heavy rain event predicted in your future. How might you use Flood Savvy to kind of monitor that, etc. What we also have is these community narratives. So with each of our 6 partners, this is a written narrative of who they are, what kind of challenges they are having, and how they are leveraging Flood Savvy and the National Water Model to then address those. So our goal here is that, Flood Savvy is great and all, but what's the story? How might these inspire others, either if you're a community or maybe you're a scientist and just want to learn what others might want to use this data for? So it's really for inspiration. And anyway, and then with the resources, we also have a specific National Water Model / NWIPS resources. So we have a tutorial, which I'll show you briefly, but we also have links to a lot of other resources. A lot of these are from NOAA themselves about either NWIPS or the National Water Model specifically. And then this is also something that we heard a lot. This is a glossary of key hydrologic terms, which I think Emma and a lot of other our folks who are not hydrologists by training kind of use themselves as guinea pigs to do, and then our communities also helped with. But what we're really proud of is our National Water Model tutorial. This is what it looks like. So a lot of those resources I showed you, they are fantastic. NOAA's done a lot of really great story maps that are really high quality on FIM, National Water Model, NWIPS. However, a lot of them are kind of complicated. A lot of what the National Water Model feels like it was developed is kind of by hydrologists for hydrologists. And obviously what we've learned in our study is there's a lot of folks that just do not have that training at all, or kind of the ask when we started developing this is, I think we had an undergrad at the time, and I said, hey, use yourself as a guinea pig, go to National Water Model and what questions do you have, and then start there for this tutorial. So that's exactly what we do. It pretends you have never been to the National Water Model before, and it'll walk you through what is it and what kinds of data and information are available. What kind of questions could it potentially help you answer that are very tailored to the community folks that we were working with? And then most importantly, it walks you through starting from this landing page step by step with lots of screenshots and lots of explanations. What is this information? What is it trying to tell you? And then in different contexts, like for how to access a gauged river data, how might you access it and use this information? So this is available on our Flood Savvy webpage right now. And I think we put a link in the chat to this. But anyway, this is the demo of what we have done. The next part, I'm going to jump into a discussion piece. But before I do that, while I'm still sharing Flood Savvy, does anybody have any questions on this? Because again, I can't answer the technical questions, but Tony and Irene are both here. So if there's any, either on the development, the co-development piece, or physically like how questions, we'd be more than happy to take those now. Sure, Madeline, or Madeline.
Hi, thanks so much for this. This is really incredible, and I absolutely love the work you guys, and I especially love the community narratives. I thought that was really creative and interesting. I was just curious, this is like a short question, but as someone who's like wanted to do something similar with a lot of the marine data here in Hawaii, like how many people would you say you need on a team to execute something like this? Because I think what happens a lot here is that people have ideas, but then it's like you don't have the funding to support, you know, the size of the team you really need. So I was just curious about like how many like hands on deck do you think you really need to do something like this?
That's a good question. So I'm gonna say it depends. So what you're looking at is we had 4, so all of us had a pretty good amount of time, I think, on this project. This was very hands-on to get to this level because we were developing something from scratch. In addition, we also had another research associate. We had revolving, I want to say like 2 to 3 graduate students and 1 undergraduate. We also had folks that just liked the project and had their own funding and wanted to help a little bit too. And we also had 1 consultant work on this. We had a pretty big team to do this. This was a pretty sizable effort. So I will not downplay that piece, but that is to develop. This is a pretty big, this Flood Savvy itself is a pretty big project. But however, I will say to just do community engagement, as I mentioned, that is a spectrum. That's different. Also, I think Irene and Tony can comment too, like there's a lot of different pieces to Flood Savvy. Like as you saw, there's a lot of different capabilities. Obviously, I didn't develop it. I can't speak to the exact time there, but I think that if you chunked this out and did something smaller, obviously your effort gets a lot smaller. You know, there's a lot of stuff going on, like our community narratives, like, yeah, those took a lot of time and we would pass those back to our community and let them review. And that's time intensive. Ask Emma. She did all of our emailing. That's why we have somebody dedicated to emailing, because it takes a lot of time, you know? So unfortunately, that's a not clean answer. It really, really depends on exactly how much you could do. And you could chunk out any piece of what we did. Flood Savvy is sort of the aggregate whole. But as you saw with our resources page, with any of these tutorials, we also have recording. We have a whole study website, which I'm not showing too, you know, like chunk out any of that. I think there's still a lot of value in them, and it doesn't always have to be this big, you know, but I would say having somebody with the technical, like this particular project, we're working with a national water model, you have to have hydrologists on this team, you know, like we could not have done this without Tony or Irene, you know, and like you do need somebody that has that community engagement expertise too. So I think it kind of depends on what you need, but bare minimum, like, you know, whatever your disciplinary areas are, one of each, or somebody that has expertise, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Got it. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, happy to chat further on that too. Or if there's like a particular piece where you're like, how long did this particular thing take or something like that, you know, we can always comment on that too.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Awesome. Awesome. Are there any other questions? Big or small? Okay.
Sorry, we just have one question in the chat that just
Sure,
came up.
yeah, please go for it.
I guess I'm going to say it out loud. Who will maintain this tool moving forward? Which is a great question.
Yes. So we are still looking at that in terms of the long-term piece. That's actually something we've also been talking with NOAA about, whether or not this is best as a private, you know, right now it's Quasi and Northeastern. We are not NOAA. So is this better as a private service? Is there any piece of this that might in the future inform how NWIPS or the National Water Model is derived? Like, for example, one of the things we work a lot with NOAA, one of the things they've commented on is until this study, they hadn't really ever been thinking too much about they call it retrospective or the historical data. It's something that is available, but they hadn't really put much emphasis on it. And that is one of the really big things that has been consistent over the 3 years of this project, is that people really want access to that for this scenario planning, for this decision-making, resilience kind of context. So that's not something that they can do in the short term. They have their plans, but for example, that's something where we're not quite sure if that might be a NOAA thing. In the interim, this is why we have Flood Savvy hosted via Quasi. So at least it is built. It is up. It is there. We are actively seeking follow-on funding now to kind of continue and expand this work. So we're still kind of figuring that out ourselves, but it is a question that we've been asking ourselves and is important for us. So again, not a great, or maybe Irene or Tony, do you have anything you wanted to add to that piece?
I think that was all you mentioned, Kristen. We talk about how we can move forward with this. This came up from a research proposal and research products, and we wanted to show that this is feasible and it's useful for the community and for the next rounds of funding that we can receive from NOAA. We are exploring other alternatives to see how we can go and create more sustainable solutions to host these tools. These might end up being integrated into the NWebs or the NOAA website at some point, or some of the capability and pieces, because everything is open source. And the intention was there to make everything lightweighted, open source. So if other groups, like some people from Mohic in Missouri, they're interested to integrate a portion of this website on their own website, that's doable. So there's a lot of things for the transferability of this tool to other places, especially to the official websites. So that's my just comment there.
Yeah. Maybe just a side note too is, yes, the physical Flood Savvy, keeping that alive. But one of the things that was always really important to us about our study is making sure that you're giving something back to the folks you're working with. And I didn't really mention that, but obviously Flood Savvy is the tool. But to me, in every project that engages any end user or stakeholder, that's always the question in my mind. Usually the 3 questions I'm asking is, what does my funder want? How do I make my funder happy and happy with what I'm doing? How do, I'm a scientist. How do I do good science and publish papers and do that kind of stuff? But then most importantly is always, how am I giving something back? Like, how am I producing science that's actually useful? So that's why we also made sure that not only, yes, we have Flood Savvy, which is useful to our community members, but we also did a formal launch event, for example, which is actually recorded. I don't know, Emma, would you mind throwing a link to our study website, maybe just to phase 3 in the chat? We have a recording where we actually had we're representative from each of the communities that we worked with help us with that launch event and actually share their own experiences of who they are and what their challenges are and how they're sharing Flood Savvy. So I think it's like over an hour recording, but if you just zip to those, I really recommend you check that out. So part of that was inviting them, making sure that they're a part of it, keeping them updated. For example, we're also preparing a manuscript for publication, and we're going to reach out to all of our stakeholders or invite them to be co-authors on this. From those earlier phases of the study, we also, every time that we had a product or something, they always got an invite to keep them in the loop. Because I've done because I do interviews for a living, I like to say yes to interviews to kind of get a sense for it. And the amount of interviews that I've been a part of, and then I never know what happens to my data, it's kind of high, So that's something that we're always cognizant of is, yes, there's the physical infrastructure and keeping Flood Savvy alive and updated, but also, to me, the sub question there is also, how do you make sure that when your study ends, your touch points and your kind of engagement with these folks kind of doesn't end? You know what I mean? I just want to offer that as kind of another perspective and something I think about a lot. And if you're interested in kind of doing any version of this work, I would encourage you to think about too.
We have a few more questions as well on the chat. A couple have been answered, I think, as well on the way. But the first is coastal flooding a different thing? And then just the other ones were, is this an MVP? Any plans to add features, future iterations of community engagement? Which I think we touched on a little bit.
Sure. So I can start with the first one. Yes, coastal is very different. That's actually a proposal I am writing at the moment. So NOAA is very interested in what they call total water level, because it is really, really complex. So here, obviously, it's riverine flooding. Obviously, it's complicated, but when you start to get in the coastal environment, not only might you have riverine inputs, you also have daily tides, you might have storm surge, you might have a hurricane coming in. It gets really complicated, and that's something that NOAA is very, very interested right now, is not only how do you model it, there's the science behind it, like how do you do that, but then there's also how do you communicate that in a way to the folks like ours that need it, who maybe are not crazy hydrologist, crazy smart hydrologist, so how do you actually communicate in the way that actually doesn't cause more confusion? So the answer is yes, that's actually something I'm directly interested in and writing a proposal on right now, which the plan would be to do kind of something similar to what we did here to start that off, But again, as a community engagement, my first thinking is, well, who are my end users and how do I not, hey, I'm going to like I should say too, my thinking is not, I'm going to go build them flood savvy for the coast. My first question is, what is their needs? Maybe this is something that would be helpful, but that's also my mindset going into a study like that is always, who are they and what are their needs first, not what do I have that I can give them? You know what I mean? So it's kind of a mindset that I use for these studies. And sorry, Emma, what was the other question?
Sure. Is this an MVP? Any plans to add features, future iterations of community engagement?
What is an MVP?
Good question.
Yeah, what is an MVP?
I don't know if Renee wants to.
Yeah.
Minimum viable product.
Gotcha. Okay. I'm a social scientist. As we mentioned, we are very interested, but obviously we are all in the research world, so we need funding first. We would love, so we have this as it's more than a prototype, it's live, but we kind of look at this as a prototype. We are very interested to see and test what would scalability mean, because obviously it took a lot of effort to build Flood Savvy as it is now, but that is one of our questions is how easy or hard would it be to start adding new regions? So that is something that we are interested in exploring. We are just looking for particular funding opportunities, but we're not really talking to a community audience, but this is something that we've been considering is if anybody had independent funding and they wanted to see, hey, could you bring this to my town or my region? That is something that we would be very interested in talking about if anybody happens to know interested folks.
Kristen, can I just add something onto that? So, I would say like we had an MVP earlier in the project where we kind of hit the basic functionality based on that table that Kristen showed in the presentation. And then we went through several revision processes. So we're a few revisions beyond an MVP, but certainly still something we consider not super hardened software. So
thank you. I would not have known that that's even where we were, because different fields have different jargon, which is why collaboration is great. Okay, were there any other questions, or for the folks who asked those questions, were there any follow-up questions to that?
I think a quick follow-up is not quite a 1.0 version then. Tony, does anyone want to jump in there? Or we have one other question.
Yeah, I guess we would have to decide what we would call it. We have written in a way that could be deployed and customized by other groups. So I guess you could argue that we're at a version 1.0, especially for the core system. I think there's just a few of these features that we've added for the communities that maybe we didn't have as much time to thoroughly test, and as the project funding kind of started to go down, so our engagement with them has stalled for a little bit, I guess, or it's a lot less intensive than it used to. So I think that's perhaps why we feel like we're not quite at a 1.0, but we probably are pretty close, if not already there. Yeah.
Sweet. And I think the last question we have, at least for now, is was it challenging to balance new feature requests and the need to keep the tool simple enough to be usable?
I want to say yes and no, but I actually kind of want to go to Tony or Irene for that, because they have a very different perspective, because they were the ones that actually had to build. So I'm kind of curious, Irene or Tony, if you have thoughts on that question.
So I could take a crack at it, and Irene, please chime in. I think that's always a challenge. One thing that I found is that if you have, in our case, we have these great social science focused researchers to handle a lot of the communication and kind of organize discussions to extract feature requests, essentially. And we were usually involved in those, but we were generally pretty quiet unless we needed to kind of chime in and clarify something. But that kept us a little bit removed from the end user. So we had a little more freedom. I feel like we had more freedom to think through how to satisfy the request in a way that kept the user interface simple, because that was a priority for us, is keeping it simple and low cost. Those were two really big things. And then obviously within budget, within our resources. on other projects I've had where I or my team is directly talking to end users, I would say lacking like the expertise in that area. Sometimes we can just get overwhelmed with tons of features, and so I may have not answered that very clearly, but I feel like the having a nice balance where you have the science expertise and the software development a little bit decoupled from the end user, and having the social science focused researchers facilitating all of that actually helped keep the kind of like the feature creep and scope creep. It kind of helped keep that from happening. And Irene, I'm curious if you have thoughts on that too.
Yeah. So my thought would, I'll answer that question. Like, yes, it was a bit challenging, at least from our perspective, who were serving on the technical team on this project. As Kristen mentioned, we hadn't decided to create a new tool or even a new platform, a website. So we started by creating some very deep instructional based, kind of tutorial based Jupyter notebooks. And in our first meeting with the stakeholders, where we wanted to grab their feedback, we shared those Jupyter notebooks, and suddenly there was this gap between us and them. We thought these are descriptive enough. We tried to make them simple, but even the simple that we thought as a hydrologist was not even close to simple for the community or the end users. And then after that, we had to change the whole approach to make sure all of those capabilities are actually defined in a way and presented in a way that can be simple enough but useful for those group of people. And that ended up for us deciding to create a new platform that provides that capabilities. Mm-hmm. And then another practice, maybe this is kind of like sharing an experience from this whole big team that we had, was we had so many internal meetings among ourselves. And every time the social science teams tried to ask a lot of questions from me and Tony to clarify things before we present them to the end user. And throughout that circulation, we modified a little bit of our language or of the terms that we use on the website or the capabilities we refer to. And then it was a learning practice for not only for us, but also for the stakeholders and end user as well. Like, we saw that they were interested in, okay, we are not familiar with the terms of interquartiles. Let's just explain them. They wanted to add more context to the historical data or to the forecast data. But to do that effectively, we had to kind of explain what do we mean if we want to add those, as you can see, the highlighted colors or the quantiles or interquartiles. And surprisingly, it was not like they said, we don't like that or this is too complex for us. Because they found the usefulness of those information, they were very open and to accept it to be added. Mm-hmm.
I think that's a really great thing, and I think too from the leader of this, the social science side too, is on the practical side. I think part of that is, yes, my team and Emma and our other team members, we were kind of the first point of contact for a lot of these stakeholders, and the big thing was we made sure we were never promising anything until we internally, and when I say internal, I mean like Irene, Tony, and Emma, then we could decide it, because obviously it's really important to know your own limits, because I am aware that if I say yes to something, I'm not a developer. I don't know actually how long that takes. I don't know how long it takes Irene and Tony to pull the data and do all their magic to make it look pretty. Like that's fantastic. You know what I mean? Just so it's it's kind of respecting each other's areas of expertise, and to your community members too. Don't overpromise, transparent, because I think there were things that we wanted to do and then it was okay, but why not? And you just explain it, you know what I mean? That's all. It's just sort of, you kind of develop that trust. And I think that's that balance too, because I think in our, our user testing that we did, I think we had like a really long laundry list of all these different things that folks wanted, but then we had to pause and sit back and say, okay, and that's kind of what we did. I think number one, it was always kind of tying it back to a particular use case, or also because we were working with a bunch of different folks, what were the most common things we heard, or like biggest ticket things? Because I think, anyway, so it's sort of this prioritization process, because you can't do it perfectly. But again, I think it's just don't say yes, because again, your end user has to like you and trust you, and you have to do right by them, and then also kind of respecting the expertise of your team members to make sure that you're not, backing anybody into a corner that can't necessarily do. And then with Irene and Tony, that's the balance too. Like maybe they had a feature that they really wanted, but then we were like, hey, well, the communities want this. So that's sort of like, that's kind of how you meet in the middle of things. You try to figure out what's the common ground and how do we do stuff like that. So why we say iterative, and it's not always going to look the same, but teams are really important, I think, in this kind of work. Okay. So we actually are going to have more discussion. So our last section, I guess, of our session today is discussion. I've really appreciated all the questions, and I hope we're going to keep some of these going. But our goal here is to kind of tap into our collective vision. So what you're going to see, or maybe I'll just back up. So what we have is I'm going to show you some of the questions, just to a broad way to start a conversation. What we're going to do is we're going to do brain writing. It's a new thing that I saw in a meeting recently, and I really liked it. To those questions, Emma's going to put a link to a Google Doc that we have made, and we're going to just be quiet for like 5-10 minutes and just let folks go in and just write stuff down. If you're comfortable with it in your Google Doc, please feel free to put your name and maybe where you're from or something. If you do not want to, you can totally remain anonymous. But if you could just go in and respond to these questions, and then once we're done, hopefully this gives folks time to think about it, then we're going to come back and use it as a starting point if anybody would kind of like to comment or reflect on any of these questions in person. So the questions that we have, and we don't have to stick to them if others pop up, but what I would be really curious to learn is, as we mentioned, Let's Have You is one example of end user engagement using earth science data. So does anybody else on the call either have experience themselves, or have you heard somebody else do a talk on how this might look for your other projects? I'm just kind of curious just to learn if you had a different experience or if you had another lesson learned. And yeah, ideally, who are your end users that you were engaging in this? So kind of anything on that topic. The second one is, we're really curious, what are the challenges that you have faced or successes that you have had in getting your earth science data used in real world decision making? And that could mean you've never done end user engagement, but you really wanted to make a tool, and I don't know, whatever your challenge was. So this is sort of ideally, and again, we're kind of getting that last question, but maybe there's a common challenge that everybody has that maybe ESIP could create a working group around, or my group could come in and do a talk on, or something like that. What big questions do you have about how to leverage community engagement, co-design or co-development, or how to communicate your work to non-science audiences? So maybe you don't have an answer at all, but there's just something stuck in your brain where maybe you don't know how to start. Like we had that question about, who do you even talk to? Maybe it's something like that. Maybe it's, what questions do you ask? So whatever it is, we're just curious to know. And then specifically, do you have any ideas for how ESIP could support you or the broader ESIP community in these efforts? So again, we're calling it community engagement. It could be co-development. It could be end user engagement, kind of anything in that world. So putting it up here, but I will stop sharing for now. And Emma, we put a link to that Google Doc in the chat. And then it is 4:57. If we could regroup I'm in Eastern time. So in 8 minutes, if we wouldn't mind coming back, and then I will open up the discussion and we can start anywhere on those. But in the meantime, if everybody in here wouldn't mind going into that Google Doc, and you don't have to respond to all of them. If one calls to you, start there. But in 8 minutes, if we could see how many we could get to in here. So I will be quiet. And if anybody does have a question or anything, just feel free to either put it in the chat or come off mute, and we will. So thank you all for participating in that. I know for me, it helps me kind of organize my thoughts before I jump into a discussion, but I kind of would like to turn it over to the collective of the group at this point. So per going through these questions, I'm curious if anybody either wanted to put it in the chat or just kind of come off mute. And for question one, if you wanted to share any other experience that you had that you think others might learn from, or you just wanted to make others aware of, or if there's any questions or challenges that you kind of wanted to ask and get feedback on from the group, I kind of wanted to open it up to anybody to see if there was anyone that had anything top of their mind. Okay, well, maybe we could start with question one. So I see in the Google Doc, there are a lot of other experiences that folks have had working, creating earth science data for non-peers. And I'm just curious if anybody wanted to share any of those and maybe kind of compare and contrast how that looked compared to what we did with Flood Savvy versus what your own experiences were. Because as we mentioned, we wanted to be clear that Flood Savvy is one example of how community engagement and designing science for non-peers can look, but it can look a lot of different ways as well.
I can share if that's helpful.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, so this is actually my old job. I don't do this anymore, but it was super, super focused on community engagement. I worked for a tool called SeaSketch. It's an open source tool specifically designed for marine spatial planning. My main job was to work on these participatory mapping surveys, actually. So getting these maps ready for people to look at and then draw their own data and their own uses for coastal areas. And this was all to be fed into them prioritization models that were then used to kind of designate protected areas. And this was mostly in response to the 30 by 30 kind of, I guess, policy. I'm not sure what to call it. The global policy that everyone kind of jumped on board to conserve 30% land and waters by 2030. And I found it really difficult, mostly because there was, I didn't actually get to talk to the end users at all. It was really moderated between, like, our funders did most of that work. And they were the ones that kind of set expectations and timelines, and then our technical team just kind of respond to them.
Gotcha.
So, I think it was really cool. I think I was really excited about what we were doing, but I definitely felt like there was kind of a block there. And then also the timelines at which we were working, also kind of dictated by our funder, were super fast. Like, their kind of pitch was like, we can do this. We can get you guys 30% protected in this really rapid time. And they're like pitching that to governments, and that put an enormous strain on the technical team. So I'm just interested to hear kind of if anyone else has had those challenges and how to balance them when they come up.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. So it sounds like you were receiving of all of the feedback, but you weren't necessarily a part of the process of seeing where those different requests or things came from.
Yeah, like, we kind of had these very standard approaches. We were working on sites all over the world, and it wasn't clear. I think one thing too, just coming from a GIS background, like anyone that works on maps, they're highly biased, and a lot of people just like to be like, yeah, this map is a map and that's the truth, but that's not the case at all. And how you display data is, can really make a huge difference. And so those were the conversations that I was hoping to have with the end users, and trying to understand, like, how is this helpful? What is this telling you? And that wasn't really possible within these timelines. So there was kind of a concern on also interpretation, I think, from me personally.
Yeah, no, that definitely sounds challenging. Did anybody else have a similar or different experience to that? Otherwise, I'm kind of curious, Irene and Tony. I'm curious too, because we did have you in a lot of our meetings with our end users, and I'm curious if you feel like that was beneficial, or if you had never met Zach or Mike or anybody, do you think that you would have had a different experience working in our project?
Yeah, I think the experience would have been significantly different. I do remember, something that Irene had mentioned in one of her answers earlier was the disconnect. For our initial thought was, hey, well, why create something for them? We'll show them how to create whatever they need, right? This incredible, and that was through Jupyter Notebooks, a huge disconnect with like what our expectations. But there's other things that I think that's one example, but other things I think that really help shape and expectations for who our community is and what they're looking to accomplish. We would have only received through those communications, and one of them is we've had several questions about what certain unit abbreviations mean, or other things that we thought were incredibly obvious, and that really just helped like bring us back down to earth. Like, hey, we're dealing with a different community. They have their own set of expertise, their own needs, and they're trying to. They have a very specific thing or a set of things they're trying to do that are very different than us. And I think if we didn't have the communication, if we weren't in as many of those meetings, we may have been kind of disconnected more and kind of been pushing some like, here, no, you should just use Jupyter Notebooks. And here, let me show you how to code this up. And
yeah.
Meanwhile, they are confused about the the units of like CFS, right?
Or the word time series. I remember
Time series.
a
What's a
whole
time
chat
series?
about time
Yeah.
series, you know, it's
Yeah.
things that seem, that one, I didn't even catch that one. That seems so obvious, but
Yeah.
it's not obvious to some.
And I would add to this, it was not like always, we had to keep it as a bare minimum that would be enough for all the end users. But at the same time, because there was a different and diverse kind of levels of the technical expertise among them, they had some hydrologists on their team, but there were another community who it was only some volunteer people or some librarian that were on that team. So based on that, we had to make sure some of them asked for, oh, this is really cool. We have our expert, they're interested in running the code behind the scene, and we want to test it for other variables or outputs of the national water model. So we had to make sure that we also provide them access to the codes that we develop. So if they have the capacity and the kind of like the people on their team, they can easily, so we can share these educational materials with them so they can access other things. So yeah, I mean, yeah, we had to be ready to kind of address both sides of the requests that were coming through.
Awesome. I also saw a lot of challenges and successes, and also some questions that folks have. I'm curious if anybody has anything that they would like to ask broadly to the group that we could maybe discuss at this point, or if you saw somebody else's that you want to respond to or reflect on. And read the first one, which I thought I really resonated with, which is found that just suggesting look at my data sheet isn't enough, and that having a presentation and figures can go a long way. And I think that's kind of almost speaking to our Jupyter Notebook example is, and to me, the example there is sort of connecting it to a particular relevant decision-making context, I think goes really, really far, you know, because I think oftentimes, you know, I've been to AGU a bunch, you know, and the amount of times I go to a session and it's, here's my data, here's my figures, here are my equations. And I, as a non-expert, I'm going, why do I care about this? But if you had just said, this will tell you when or if a flood will happen, or this will tell you, help you calculate whatever, and you actually connect it back, that does wonders, you know what I mean? And I think, so that's where, to me, the end user engagement piece is really super important in that as well. I'll just maybe leave that there in case anybody has any other things that maybe stood out to them from things they saw or questions that they wanted to address.
I think the third comment here really resonated with me, in that I think for earth science data, there are so many different data types out there. But if users or stakeholders can't actually access your data or like use it in a meaningful way, then that's a huge barrier.
Yeah.
And sometimes it is like a technical knowledge, like, okay, I'm not super savvy in GIS, but if the data is not findable or fair for people to actually access, then that's just a huge barrier to whatever science you are doing.
Yes. We would definitely agree. I think that's always been one of our main takeaways is all of the data that we worked with is available. Technically, you can go and anybody can have quote unquote the data, but is it actually in a format that is meeting the needs of those that stand to benefit from it? That's two different, very different questions. That's always something that we harp on is available does not always mean accessible. And that means a lot of different things depending on who exactly you're going to look at, because Irene and Tony, if they had presented that to Jupyter Notebooks, like we're a part of this product was funded by Cairo. It's a cooperative institute for research operations and hydrology. If they had presented that at a Cairo conference, I bet 95% of the audience would have been, oh, yep, great. But that's not necessarily true of everyone.
Yeah, this is Liz. I'm at NASA
Cool.
as a contractor there, but I think it's so true that we make all of our data available, but it can be a real burden for communities to try to understand it and figure out how to use it. So I do a lot of Arctic work, and I put a comment in there. But one thing that we did was we just made these community-focused booklets where we just tried to take the data product. We made a plain language summary, and we made a little map that just showed what the data set looked like over this this particular community. And we asked for the communities to tell us ahead of time, like, what are you most interested in? So we can try to give you those products for the booklet, because we've done this big campaign in Alaska and Canada, and so we're working with communities up there, and we have 250 data products overall that have been developed. So we just like pulled out 20 of them and made these little booklets, but it's really challenging. And these are folks that don't have they don't always have great internet connections, so you can't be downloading big things or data sets or even using story maps sometimes because they don't have the bandwidth for that. So we just made these PDFs because it was a way that people could interact with the data set in a way that works for them.
Yeah, I actually had a similar experience. We had some NASA funding, and the question at the time of Sura Rose's opportunity was, how can NASA Earth observation data be used in to address environmental justice concerns? So we were working with folks in Puerto Rico, and some of the basics during our interviews was, what? I thought NASA was just about the stars. And they didn't even know that there were a lot of really cool NASA tools that could honestly answer a lot of their questions. And we also found the same thing was, there's some of them have internet access. A lot of them are maybe old and retired, and it really, really depends. And we ended up, because we were working with Boundary Organization there, what they recommended is they literally wanted print handouts with QR codes that somebody could go on their cell phone and really simple descriptions. So anyway, we ended up having this whole, we had our nice NASA report, which was all this fancy science stuff. And then we had our community report, which was directly tailored to that context. So yeah. And again, it's just there's a lot of and that's sort of my passion. And there's so much cool data and science out there, and it is so impactful, but is it actually getting into the hands of the folks that stand to really benefit from it?
Another challenge that I wrote in the comments too was just about how a lot of times when you have these grants with this, like a 3-year funding cycle or something, you develop this really cool tool like this water tool, but then after your 3 years, you don't get to update it with new data, or you can't go back and tweak your tool because you've got to move on to the next thing. And I think that's such a hard thing for communities to then be able to implement new tools and ideas into their workflows, and land managers too. It just makes it, and it's just part of this. I don't know how to solve that exactly, but it's just an issue that continues to crop up.
Yeah, I completely agree. I also wish that I knew how to solve that one too. Jonathan.
Yeah, so I was thinking about I didn't write this in the document, but I was thinking about the project you presented and how it would be received by communities outside of your core, your research, the people you engaged with. Mm-hmm. So there's so much going on in the environment. Flooding might just be one of the risks or hazards that they might encounter at any given time. So we've already kind of fragmented the science in a way that's not congruent with the way they view the world. Mm-hmm. That could be one of the challenges we're having is, we're kind of taking bites out of a bigger puzzle, bigger mm-hmm. pie. And we, because of this process, obviously we can't do everything all at once. But so do you have any thoughts on how to tackle that incongruence with our audience?
Yeah, again, I wish that I would have a perfect answer to that, but I definitely think that is true. That's usually one of the anecdotes I say is, well, I spend a lot of time thinking about flooding and water, but not everybody does. And that's also true. And that's part of when we say about we'd be really curious about scaling flood savvy. That's kind of part of it too, is what about those areas that are actually more concerned about drought than they are with flooding? Like technically, the National Water Model could maybe, but it's not necessarily we called it flood savvy, first of all. So that's not necessarily what we set it up for. But for example, what about that use case? Or, like the folks out west when they're dealing with more like water budgeting, you know what I mean? So yes, it's kind of drought, but it's kind of an entirely different context. That's something we learned about in phase 1, of our study, but, we took it in a different direction. Those are even just water challenges, So I don't have a perfect answer, but to me, my first reaction anytime I don't know is to ask. To me, that is my philosophy on community engagement is if I don't know, I ask, So for example, I could see that being a whole study, could you go into a multi-hazard region and then do what we did, but just bottom up it, what are their challenges? What do they use? Because one of the things I do hear all the time is, man, that's another tool. they have to go to 8,000 different places to get all of this different information. And obviously there's like, different federal agencies, there's different boundaries that you have to like be aware of. So I don't have perfect answers, but at least that is, as a scientist, my perspective as a scientist is, if I don't know, that sounds like a study and somebody should ask, and I also should disclaimer, I'm an interdisciplinary scientist. I don't really believe in silos. Like I understand why they exist, but I'm usually anti-silo. I love a cross-disciplinary kind of perspective that also sounds like the kind of study you shouldn't just have a flood researcher looking into or a wildfire researcher. Like you would want a nice multi-perspective team to kind of go and poke around and try to figure that one out, and the folks who are trying to benefit from it and whatever federal agencies you're trying to tailor their tools to. So I'm curious if anybody has seen anybody do that successfully, but to me, I would love to kind of ask the folks on the ground what they would need in that context. And because I don't know, I think it is kind of complicated. And I do know that there are a lot of different tools available to do very niche things, and how you aggregate that, I'm not even sure.
Yeah, I put in the chat the Weather Service warnings Discovery Cluster meeting I hosted a couple years ago, and they do that at a regional level at the Weather Service. They'll look at floods, but also snowstorms, other hazards, and that is a clustering that makes sense from the NOAA mission area. Mm-hmm. But even then, you still get the fragmentation that comes from the way that science, has these disciplines and it's siloed. So that naturally lends our products, our data, everything to be fragmented in how we present it to the world. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a fundamental challenge. And I also thought maybe, I'm not suggesting this is a better approach, but that artificial intelligence might be, in the long run, a solution that it could help develop very community-focused solutions. So it builds the data based on the needs from particular communities, and it can scale to every community that it engages with.
Yeah, that's awesome. So one other perspective on that too is, as a person who doesn't believe in disciplinary silos, I do this personally, but I also kind of advocate for, just if you belong to one discipline, just try putting yourself in places that are not part of your same discipline. It's like, obviously I'm a social scientist. I end up at a lot of hydrology meetings and things like that, or like, I'm not a NASA scientist, but I go and do NASA projects, so I think that there is kind of a beauty in you yourself kind of breaking them down, because often hydrologists love to talk to hydrologists, economists love to talk to economists, and that's usually one of my pet peeves, is when you step in somewhere and it's just pure jargon and clearly we haven't talked to enough other people. Sometimes I'm guilty of it too, but I think that that's something that I try to do myself. Like I often try to publish in journals that are not really of my home discipline, just because like I think community engagement can apply almost anywhere. So I try to put that in places where I'm not just talking to I'm not going to community science, I'm going to other journals, so that's just does not solve that problem. But I think that, just on a personal level, is something that I try to do. And I really value that, just to see how other disciplines think and work. And then that kind of helps me when I'm trying to bridge that too. So I help a little bit, I guess, in the long run, if other folks did it more often. So. Okay. So we have 5 minutes left, and I just wanted to at least allow us to see if anybody had any ideas. So our last question was, if anybody has ideas for how ESIP could support you or the broader community in these efforts. And I did see a lot of great ideas come through. So again, I just wanted to open up and see if anybody had any ideas they wanted to share more broadly. Otherwise, I wanted to call one out that stuck out to me was, what about having a group of ESIP members that are willing to be engaged in studies as testers from outside disciplines? I thought that was a great idea. That's something that I try to do all the time. Like if I'm worried about a talk, I will go find somebody that does not, oftentimes my husband, who has no idea what I'm doing, and try to use them as a guinea pig. But I also think that that's a great opportunity. Like Irene and Tony, as I mentioned, my side of the team, we are the social scientists. They would practice on us and try on us first. And we were able to say, I don't understand this. What do you mean? Like I remember a whole diatribe one time between the difference of historical data and retrospective data, which we got to guinea pig before we got to the broader community, So anyway, I just thought that was a really great idea. If anybody else had any ones that they wanted to share.
Well, since nobody else spoke up, I'll just shamelessly plug my session on Friday, which is on for a new ESID cluster on Earth observations for land management.
Ooh.
And so we're hopefully gonna talk about we have some discussion time and some scenarios we can go through depending on how many people come to our session. So hope you all can make it.
That sounds great.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we are at our last 3 minutes, so I'll hang out here if anybody else wants to chime in and either talk about these questions just as a lingering question or wants to chat about anything. Otherwise, thank you all for taking the time to be with us today. I really enjoyed this, and I really hope you have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your ESID meeting.